Hi everyone, welcome to the presentation of my dissertation entitled Diversity and Learnability in Early Language Acquisition Across Languages and Cultures. I will start with an introduction of the terms of diversity, cross-linguistic and cross-cultural, and learnability. In part 1, I will then focus on studies across languages and describe a sample project from the first half of my thesis. In part 2, I will look at learnability and diversity across cultures and will describe a sample project from the second half of my thesis. The presentation ends with a general discussion. One major source of diversity in language acquisition is diversity across languages. There is still little evidence on how learning different languages may affect the learning trajectory. For example, the Journal of Child Language, up to 2013, had published 69% of the papers looking at English language acquisition. 17% of the papers would look at learning another 16 Indo-European languages, and only the remaining 14% looks at other language families. However, 6,000 languages are spoken today, and most of them are not Indo-European. Also, English findings are not generalizable across languages because they differ maximally in their typological characteristics. For example, Inuktitut is an Inuit agglutinative polysynthetic language, which encodes more grammatical categories and in such a diverse way than English. We can say with no doubt that typologically different languages are a source of input diversity. Cultures are also not well represented in language acquisition literature yet. Most research bears on children growing up within North American and European families, as we can see in the study which was published by Nielsen in 2017, who took into consideration 3 different journals. However, most children do not grow up in these families. This sample is also not representative of language acquisition around the world due to the differences between the cultures. For example, Schneidman and Golden Meadow recorded 2 groups of children from different populations in Chicago, learning English and Yucatec Maya. In the graph, there is the English and Yucatec Mayan there is languages, English and Yucatec Maya, and in the y-axis, you may see the input percentage by different speakers. The gray is the adult speech, so speech produced by adults, and the black is speech produced by other children. So although in Chicago English, the adults are the main and most important speakers to the child, in Yucatec, the heard input is mostly coming from other children. Another important information is that in Yucatec, most of this input is not even directed to the child, but it's mostly overheard speech. This changes the register, the type of the speech. Thus, we can say that different speakers and registers are also a source of input diversity. But why am I talking about input at all? Because input seems to matter, and differences, even small ones, may have consequences in later language development. And here, the input differences across diverse languages and cultures risk to be huge. With respect to language acquisition in general, children hear this input language from their caregiver, and through the use of cognitive mechanisms via the system, they produce non-observable output at the beginning, so linguistic representations, and later on, this output would become observable with speech and signs. This diversity in input can be measured looking at input speech features, which we expect them to differ. Hypotheses on learnability can be made based on these features. This input may be treated, for example, in a different way by the system and even result in differences in output. During the first part of my PhD, I was first author in 4 papers on cross-linguistic acquisition, of which I'm today going to present 1. The papers, 2 of the papers were looking at morphological complexity, and how it affects word segmentation and segmentation of word and subword units. Another paper was about an artificial language experiment. In the second part of my thesis, I first authored 2 papers on cross-cultural acquisition, one of which I'm going to present here. One paper is modeling, and the second paper is corpus analysis. Let's now head to part 1, learnability and diversity across languages. Since learnability is a very broad term, I will focus on segmentability. Segmentation is one of the first tasks that children need to accomplish when learning their native language. Their caregiver's input is continuous, and there are no boundaries separating words when we speak. However, infants, they do manage to learn where words start and end, and by the end of their first year, they have built a lexicon of several word-like units, somehow segmenting their caregiver's continuous linguistic input. So they should use some kind of segmentation mechanisms. In the first sample project, we plan to assess the cross-linguistic viability of several segmentation strategies on 8 typologically distinct languages from the active database, which have been sampled based on 12 variables on morphology and word order. The database has transcriptions of ecological longitudinal input heard by children learning one of these languages. You may find the languages below. Each one of the languages comes from a different linguistic family, and one of the variables is, for example, noun and verb synthesis, so the number of grammatical categories which are expressed by the noun and the verb. You may also see the number of target children which were recording and the number of input utterances. A clever way to test cross-linguistic viability is by using computational modeling in order to see whether segmentation performance on diverse input in order to test the segmentation performance on diverse input with plausible strategies. So the way to do so is the model is exposed to the input that has been heard by the child, and it then processes this input using an algorithm or a strategy which is similar to a supposed cognitive mechanism. Then the output of the model may give us insights on the plausibility of the mechanism and the informativity of the input data. It kind of simulates the process of a task in language acquisition, looking for intrinsic learnability differences in these controlled conditions, when we can control the input and the model, and using lots of data, more than what a child would be able to hear in a lab experiment. WordSeq is a package that contains plausible segmentation models. The models are based on the idea that infants could use distributional cues, track co-occurrence frequencies, and extract frequent chunks of speech. Here is an overview of the WordSeq suite. So the black box indicates the input from the user, which in this case is a phonologized text. The corpus would get prepared for segmentation by removing the word boundaries and unitizing the corpus. So it's just sequences of phonemes. The original corpus will be kept and used as a gold corpus for eventual evaluation. Once the prepared corpus is ready for segmentation, we apply one or more models, which are unsupervised, meaning that they do not receive any feedback other than the input, and they don't have access to a high-level linguistic information. And then we evaluate the segmented corpus with the gold. So the output would be the input, but with proposed word boundaries. 2 key questions are part of this study. First, we ask whether models perform above chance for all languages. If yes, we suppose that their cues are functionally useful, so because they perform better than chance, and whether their rank ordering is similar across languages. If yes, we would suppose that models pick up on general linguistic properties and not some cue which is language dependent and may not work for some languages. So if the models are met, if these conditions are met, then the model employs plausible strategies for early word segmentation. So we have our active input, which is given to the WordSeg package, and we're going to ask these two questions, whether they perform above chance and whether models perform equally well across languages, or there is some model that performs well in one language and bad in another language. So with respect to the first question, whether models perform above chance, we define chance as above chance as better than baselines. And there are two baselines, one where no segmentation happens, so the input is the same as the output, and the second one when a learner is innately informed about the average word length and cuts at the probability level of this average word length. And since in the reduced lexicon, which is expected in child-directed speech, words average 6 phonemes across some languages, we would use this probability. The first baseline correctly segmented in average 13% of the word tokens across languages, and the second baseline segmented about 12%. DIPS and TP are sublexical models as they look for word boundaries using local cues. DIPS measures diphthong probabilities and is based on the idea that diphthong spanning a phrase boundary would also span word breaks. TP is based on the idea that transition probabilities are lower at word boundaries than at word middles. And there are many versions of it, depending on the threshold, on the direction, whether it's forward, backward, it has mutual information. We are going to see the mean now. DIPS performed better than 8 out of 8 languages for both baselines, and TP performed better than 7 out of 8 languages. AG and Paddle are lexical models, as they look for coherent units and they try to build a lexicon. And the adapter grammar, AG, tries to build the most likely lexicon of frequently repeated sequences, and then will segment based on this lexicon. Paddle, on the contrary, builds a lexicon initially treating each utterance as a lexical item, and then incrementally it starts cutting based on previously learned items. As you can see, the adapter grammar segmented better than baselines in 6 out of 8 and 7 out of 8 languages, and Paddle in 6 out of 8 languages. With respect to the second question, we measured rank ordering by creating a vector for each language. Each number of the vector corresponds to a model. So for example, 5 is Paddle, and it is the worst performing algorithm in Xinjiang and the fifth best algorithm in Sesotho. And according to a Spearman correlation of the rank ordering across languages, the models seem to be correlated similarly. You may ask me later about Inuktitut and Russian, which seem to have the most differences in the matrix. So in sum, we've observed that proposed models perform stably across languages. We can thus conclude that models are potentially plausible candidates for early word segmentation, especially DIPS, as they satisfy criteria of high performance and stability. And we also see that differences in language structure were actually not large enough to create particular difficulties in segmentation. And let's now move to part 2. Apart from language, culture may possibly be a second powerful source of diversity that could impact learnability. We talked about diversity across cultures. We capture this diversity looking at different cultures. A Euro-American, European looking at 2 big cities in France, where children learn French, and a non-industrial rural one in a village of 500 people in South African Lesotho, where children learn Sesotho. The second culture has been documented to have extended family units, and children hang out in peer groups early on. This study has 2 key questions. For both cultures, we do a descriptive analysis of diversity by asking who is the speaker and what are the registers. We also take a first step into studying learnability by asking about the values of input features which are related to learnability. But what are the input features related to learnability? It's well documented that, at least in European cultures, maternal child-directed input is crucial to acquisition, and it's actually the best you can get due to its simplified, engaging features. However, little is known about Sesotho. For this, we are going to study 3 different types of features: morphosyntactic, lexical, and interactional. Morphosyntactic, looking at mean utterance length in words. Lexical, looking at lexical diversity by measuring type token ratio controlling for corpus size, and interactional by looking at the ratio of questions. So the number of questions divided by the number of utterances. In order to identify child-directed speech, we needed to annotate addressees in ecological longitudinal corpora, which consist of input of 3 toddlers for Sesotho. All of these toddlers have siblings. For French, we annotated addressees in the French Paris and Lyon corpora, where we chose 3 toddlers, those with siblings and with the same age range as in Sesotho. Once we annotated the corpora and we prepared them, the results of the first question, so that the input composition is different. As we can see in the graph, the 3 children in the x-axis and the proportion of input per speaker in the y-axis, we see that other child speech is blue, maternal speech is green, and other adult speech is red. The mother is the main speaker in French, but other children are the main speakers in Sesotho. This result is extremely interesting, given that in previous studies, sibling input seems to have an adverse effect on language outcomes. However, cultures are similar in that all children hear a lot of child-directed speech, ranging from 53 to 91% in Sesotho and 84 to 92% in French. We then looked at qualitative features of child-directed speech. In the graphs, you may find French and Sesotho in the x-axis, and mean utterance length, type token ratio, and question ratio in the y-axis. The mother is again in green, the other children's speech is in blue, and the other adult speech is in red. Child-directed speech from other children is similar to maternal and other adult speech, except for the ratio of questions, and this applies to both cultures. We may then conclude that we found both similarities, the registers, and differences, the speakers, in input when we compared across cultures. The prevalence of speech from other children invites research on what kind and what amount of input is necessary for acquisition. To sum up, let's look at what the results meant. Based on results from these 2 studies, and also others that I did not have the time to present today, my initial hypothesis that diversity, as was studied here, affects learnability is now overwritten by the one that learning seems to be robust across diversity. I specifically looked for maximally diverse input based on some variables, which indeed presented differences in speech features that it presented differences in composition. However, I found smaller differences in speech features than what I was expecting to find, at least in the morphology as was shown in Project 1 and speakers as was shown in Project 2. This may not come as a surprise, however. Ecological, large-scale, everyday input may present less differences in these domains than what we may find in lab talk. That said, we still know so little on all these different cultures and languages. We need more research on how representative these results are out there. With respect to the system, early segmentation strategies seem to be robust, and input for the input that we had in the active database provided enough information so that they can have a head start in finding some boundaries. Of course, this only applies to segmentation as it was studied here. There are several other tasks, such as involving further in acquisition of vocabulary and grammar, which may have different prerequisites in input. Moreover, diverse and large-scale input helps us to see the big picture. Once all the diversity is taken into account, the output, even if it's just modeling output as was studied here, can offer insights on which factors count. For example, the specific morphological and word order factors studied in part 1 may not matter to segmentability as much as we may have guessed based on previous studies. Different features as well, such as the interactional ratio of questions, need to be further discussed, asking whether they may affect output. On the other hand, variance which is unaccounted for may mean that there are some factors or some features, some mechanisms which are relevant and should be further investigated. Take, for example, the deviation of Frozen in Project 1. During my postdoc, I'm really looking forward to plan working on human output, asking which factors predict human word learning and how model output compares to human output, and hoping to distinguish which of these factors and of these mechanisms can actually explain lexical acquisition. Thanks to my collaborators and thanks to you, I'm really looking forward to our discussion.